Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons, a philosophy podcast about big topics in bite-sized pieces. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education at Liberty University, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of philosophy and English at Genesee Community College. Knowledge is power. We've all heard the saying, but few of us have stopped to actually consider the implication. Paired with a consciousness that allows for forethought, knowledge is what allows humankind to prosper. That prosperity has created a vast, rich, and unique legacy with equally vast, deep, and unique problems. Today we'll look at what knowledge is, if it's possible, how humans use it for better or worse, and if knowledge can help the human species cheat extinction. All right, so we've got a couple things to talk about today, and we were talking about it right before we started recording, which is that we've gotten to the point now where we've put together enough episodes that we can reference back stuff and talk about some things and connect them, which is what philosophy and critical thinking are about, is, you know, reflecting on things you already know and your prior knowledge and creating new knowledge out of it. So we'll probably reflect a lot on the episode that we just did on self and, as well as epistemology and ontology. It's stuff that you have to talk about when you're talking about knowledge. So if you are just listening to this podcast, we might reference back to some of the other ones a little bit. Especially, I was talking about how we mentioned the ship of Theseus last week, and how do you know if your self is one self that you're adding and subtracting from throughout time, or if you're different selves as you go along. And then during the week, that thought came back up to me, and I realized, that's not just a psychological, sort of thing. It's also a physical kind of thing, because there's a study that came out about a year ago that said that by weight, humans are more bacteria or other living things than they are the single organism. So in that sort of way, it's almost, you have different things that make up what you are, and you have a sort of a symbiotic and synergistic relationship where one can't survive without the other. And it makes you wonder, well, are those tiny organisms part of me, or are they their own distinct thing, or how does it all work out, So, and these are all problems of knowledge. How do we know what things are? And we've referenced a lot of times throughout the podcast, categorization. That's the key term with human knowledge, is categorization. Can we put it into a box that adequately describes the concept we're trying to construct? And what we're finding out is that we almost never can. There's always always exceptions, or things that just don't work, and then it's the job of philosophy to try to corral them back in, or come up with a new concept. So let's start by trying to put knowledge in its own box. So, the purpose of knowledge is putting things in boxes. Now let's try to put it in its own box. So let's talk about defining what knowledge is in terms of knowing something versus believing something versus speculating. So inside, we talked about last weekend, I versus me, the self that reflects versus the self that is reflected upon. So in terms of that system, believing and knowing are essentially the same thing. If I believe something, to me that is knowledge, but to the objective outside world, it may not be. So how philosophers sort of frame that argument?
Well, we'll start with Edmund Gettier. A 20th century philosopher. He said that having a belief that is true, supported by evidence, is not necessarily having knowledge. So he uses the example of a clock. You'll like this, eh? So you set a clock, you wake up, you see the time. Let's say it's 6 a.m. and it is right. Unless exactly 12 hours earlier, the battery stopped and that clock was at 6, but it wasn't 6 a.m., it was 6 p.m. You believe that it's 6, you see that it's on 6, and you wake up and the sun is shining. But if it's what the clock says is not necessarily what is. And so he uses this mechanistic example to say that whether the spring is broken or something else, is just because we believe, that doesn't make it knowledge. Knowledge is that which is measurable. Oh, well, okay. So I believe that between where you live and the highway is X number of yards. I estimate. That doesn't mean my estimate is accurate. But if somebody says, oh, okay, because they don't measure even as well as I do, which is not well, then they've accepted a belief because whatever the authority is, whether age or whatever, somehow they think they've ceded authority to me as one example of, and on goes the potential inaccuracy.
Right. And I think that's a big problem with knowledge that we have in the current day and age is, like you're saying, the definition between a knowledge and belief is finding some sort of empirical measurement system to compare the two and then coming to an agreement. But, and I think the problem in ancient times was finding a measurement system that everybody agrees on. All right, this is going to be a foot or a kilogram or whatever it is,
or a stone. The British folks,
or the most ancient, the most ancient examples, and I think it was the Han Dynasty China, where they decided how wide the wagon wheel tracks would be throughout the country so that everybody could ride in the roads. But I think nowadays that's established, so a lot of people will see information and without really questioning what the measurement system is, just kind of accept that because, like you were saying, an authority, somebody who has a certain age or a certain title or a certain thing. All right, they're an authority on this, so I'm going to take what they're saying as true.
And we necessarily need to do that. We're in a culture right now that is devaluing authority, and I'm not talking about political authority. That's an entirely different topic. But just the idea that we are, this is a soapbox thing, but we're sort of a bipolar society in the sense that we say we value education, but we don't want people to be elitist. We say we value education, but we don't want to accept that some people know more than others about certain things, because if they know more than others and they tell you that they know more, then they start losing social credit to be isolated. And so we want knowledge, but we don't want it. and then we have the illusion of explanatory depth, IOED. And so we have, and this is about hard knowledge. So hard knowledge in philosophy is considered knowledge that is divorced from values, divorced from personal backgrounds, just tangibly is. And we say we have knowledge of a refrigerator. And so, what, do you know how a refrigerator works? Well, sure. I plug it into the wall and it keeps things cold. No, that's not what I asked. Can you tell me how a refrigerator functions? Lots of people, including myself, when pressed to it, would say, oh, not so much. I know that there's intense cold created and the heat has to be given off in order for the cold. And if you have the humility to say, well, I guess I just stepped in it, didn't I? I really don't know as much as I thought I did about a refrigerator. So we think we have knowledge. When we're honest about the knowledge, if we can be honest about the knowledge that we don't have, that makes us more ready to go out and get it philosophically.
Yeah, so there's kind of two distinct problems that are almost diametrically opposed to each other, which is where you'll have, on the one hand, people who will accept an authority without questioning where the information's coming from. And I think that problem is concerned with sort of seeing some of these people not as humans. Like, you had cold fusion back in the day where these guys were legitimate scientists. They were legitimate people, but they're still people. And as people, they wanted to make the next discovery. They wanted to do the next thing. And as a result, they were willing to fudge a little bit of their numbers and they got off track. So scientists are people, academics are people, just like everybody else, with the same desires, the same sort of things they struggle with.
Absolutely. That's why you have to have the checks and balances built into that. But
so they can't be accepted blindly. And that's why peer review and those sorts of things exist, but also why people need to look at sources and things for themselves. But the same end, at the other end of the spectrum, you have the people you just described where because the technology and knowledge has become so advanced and so specialized, there's people where they reach a point where if I can't understand this, then it's magic and I'm not inclined to believe something, and climate change is a big one. Where, people will say that, oh, well, look at it's 8 degrees outside right now. So much for climate change. But what you don't understand is that climate change affects the jet stream. And so that's why, even 10 or 15 years ago, it would be 30, 35 degrees all winter. Whereas now you get 60-degree days, you'll get -5 degree days. And that's because the jet stream's going up and down.
The polar vortex shifts. There was a whole discussion about that recently. So
this is a system that's so complex, not even the people who are studying it understand exactly what's going on.
Like your human being, us as a corporate entity made of all kinds of organisms, right? We don't understand us. So it's not surprising we don't understand.
Yeah. So knowledge is changing and adapting every day. And I think that's something that should be exciting and should make people want to learn. But instead, people want to skip the learning step and just immediately jump to the having an opinion or having a belief step. And so that kind of frames the societal problem of knowledge, which it wasn't really where I planned on going with that, but I think that it's good for the conversation. So that sort of brings us up to Moore's paradox, which kind of encapsulates the problem a little bit. And part of what that says is that, if you have a first person present tense sentence, like it's raining, but I don't believe that it's raining, or it's raining, but I believe that it's not raining. One thing that Moore noted is that those sentences seem absurd, but in actuality, they can be true. They're logically consistent and cohesive, and they're not obviously contradictions. And that kind of talks about what we were just mentioning, which is that knowledge and belief are separate things and people need to understand the difference between the two. You can't, just because you believe something doesn't make it truth. So let's talk about types of knowledge. So situated knowledge versus the ability to generalize. And that's a pretty important human concept. And it's something that in education is really struggled with. You learn something in the classroom. Now, how do you have a student that takes what they learned in that classroom, in that very specific, very, situated instance, and how do they bring that to regular everyday life? So what's the background behind that? How do we learn things and then apply it?
Okay. So I'm going to use slightly different terms, but I like your use of the situated and so on. So in philosophical terms, there's foundationalism and there's non-foundationalism. And foundationalism says knowledge rests on a foundation of basic beliefs that we know to be true without inferring. Okay, so the situational. I feel a pain. I see something blue. I exist. 2 + 3 = 5. So we know to be true without inferring these things for various reasons. My body tells me I hurt. Well, except we talked about this in a podcast earlier, except for the ghost pain when you don't have a limb and then you feel, but you're still feeling a pain.
Yeah, and that kind of muddies everything up is when you start to talk about skepticism or, you start to conduct some of these experiments, sort of testing the ghost in the machine a little bit,
It is. And the non-foundational even gets more complicated because it's a web of interconnected beliefs which reinforce each other. The non-foundationalists say there's things are coherent if the beliefs all adhere. if they hold together. If they cohere with other beliefs, and there's a stack of beliefs that reinforces other beliefs, and it all works, then it's a non-foundational knowledge. It's not necessarily accurate, but it guides a life.
So somebody like Hitler would be a good example of that, because you have somebody that believes something, then somebody around him starts to believe something about him, and then the general public starts to believe something about that system. And then even though what's being said is absurd or inaccurate, all of a sudden you have an entire group operating on the principles of this non-foundational knowledge. And then at that point, it doesn't matter whether the premise is true or false. What matters is the consequences of the
belief, and it cascades. So look what you said about climate change a moment ago. There are lots of people that I care about in my life say the same kind of thing that you said. Well, sure, climate change. Ha ha! Look how cold it is today. Well, so the belief about climate change is that global warming means everything is going to get warm. Everything isn't warm, therefore global warming doesn't exist. So we get into a false logic or inaccurate logic, but observable circumstance in a local situated moment reinforces people's beliefs, because, there are all kinds of reasons people don't want to believe. But I think for Christmas, my wife gave me this wonderful shirt, Science. The wonderful thing about it is that it's true even if you don't believe in it. So, but is that foundational or non-foundational? Anyway, so is there coherence? And then there's another issue is, and it's related to what you were talking about, how certain do you have to be in order to know something?
Right, because that's one of the questions that immediately popped up to me when you started talking about foundational knowledge was, okay, I have pain, therefore it exists, or I'm thinking, therefore I am. Those sorts of things I think seem intuitive to people, but I think most people, when you say 2 plus 3 equals 5, that's where a lot of people start to say, well, wait a minute, how do I know 2 plus 3 equals 5? What are numbers? There's a comedian that I like, Mitch Hedberg. He told a joke one time talking about shampoo and conditioner. And he said, 2 and 1 is a BS term. 2 can't fit into 1. That's why 2 was invented. And I mean, it's a joke, but it brings up that point. Yeah, 2 can't fit into 1. That's why 2 was invented. So the whole idea of numbers, like, okay, well, how do we know what numbers are? What sort of knowledge do you have to establish it as knowledge, as opposed to saying, this is something that I believe. I believe 2 plus 3 equals 5,
Well, there's all, and that brings up another dichotomy, another two-ness, duality, is a priori knowledge, which is knowledge gained through reason, not through experience. Mm. And one could argue that when you're thinking about numbers and you are gaining the knowledge of that, and through reason, through logic, 1 plus 1 equals 2. And then we go to test it. But then there's Latin terms, a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge you're gaining through your sensory experience.
Right. So I think I remember a big example of this was Plato versus Aristotle, and wanting to figure out how many teeth a horse has in its head. And so Aristotle, like the Aristotelian point of view, was in favor of just going and counting the horse's teeth, whereas Plato was, no, let's speculate about it and think about, the shape of the horse's jaw, how many teeth could it fit? And so that seems absurd. Like, no, just go count the horse's teeth. But, you also have to think about the flip side to that, which the climate change argument we were just talking about is, if you're going purely on the sensation and the concrete and what's in front of you, then that can lead to false premises, the same way that speculating about how many teeth can fit in a horse's head can obviously lead you astray instead of just counting them. I think a lot of it is trying to figure out
how to put the two together.
Right. And again, coming back to that, the core concept of how do I take a general principle or how do I extract knowledge from a certain situation and apply it generally? And so I think it's a back and forth sort of process.
There are two more terms for this. Maybe we're getting too academic, but I have to, but we're in it now. So, all right. So they're analytic propositions. These are the a priori kinds of things. These are the things we arrive at through reason. They're true by definition. So I scribble one on a card. All bachelors are married. You don't have to have a bachelor in front of you. All bachelors are married. We think about the term. Is that true? Or all bachelors are unmarried? Which is it?
Right. Obviously, they're unmarried by definition.
Yeah, right. So you have to reasonably say, well, I'm going to think about the definition of bachelor.
I need to go find a bachelor. And
that's exactly right. Right. Okay. So then we go to synthetic propositions. These are things we observe about the world. Paris is the capital of France, or I am living in Silver Springs or Warsaw, things which you can know by looking at the sign where you live, things that you know because you moved there and you bought a piece. So we don't want to get too granular about it, but there are two different things and they do influence each other. Maybe I know lots of people and people called them bachelors, and that's how I learned the word when I was a little kid, and everybody talked about them because they weren't married. Or I look in a dictionary. Or I just sit and reason, well, if it's a bachelor, somebody who's single, then they must not be married. So, but the certainty level.
Right. So this segues really nice into the next category, which is, so we've built a pretty strong abstract system here saying, all right, well, there's foundational and unfoundational knowledge. And if we can string together logically consistent things, and we can accept them as being known. I live in Warsaw, France. Paris is the capital of France. But now we're moving into conceptual validity, and Socrates and his end is knowing anything possible. So Paris is the capital of France. Yeah, that goes without saying. But let's say where do we say Paris starts and ends? Or why does the word Paris represent the same conceptual idea to me as it does to a Parisian? Or any number of things, you can become granular and you can look at it and say, well, this concept, Paris, probably isn't homogenous among all the people who need to think of it as a solid concept.
Yeah, well, no, you're using a really good example because it goes back to the corporate thing you talked about before. Where do the biological entities within me end and I begin?
Right.
Or do we? We live in the Rochester-Buffalo area. Okay, so Rochester refers to the Rochester region, defining a whole area by Rochester. But where does Rochester end? Well, you can pull out the zoning maps. You can pull out the political maps, the things that have been determined by surveyors back to whenever, and have the accurate definition of Rochester. But is that helpful when you're talking about the needs of the people in Rochester or the Rochester region, which would even include us?
Right. And also how people define themselves. That's a problem we come up with in New York. As you move farther and farther downstate, you have an upstate that's predominantly Republican, and New York City is, predominantly Democratic. And so I think that when you get into that sort of, south of Albany, probably your political views, I would not be surprised if your political views indicate whether you consider yourself a central New Yorker or a upstate New Yorker or a Western New Yorker, or just a New Yorker, because I think that those terms will come to, those definitions. You want them to say something about you.
But you want the category to be accurate, but you don't want to be in somebody else's category. So you're talking about categories. I am not I'm going to take a what if. Somebody says, I am not a New Yorker, following your thing, because I'm a Western New Yorker. We don't believe the same things as those people down in the Southern Tier.
Right. Yeah.
They're Southern Tier New Yorkers. Oh, so there are many New Yorks. So we can't say that we live in one place. If you pull it out to the granular, then you finally see why we're having so much trouble that we're having, because, I'm not a New Yorker. I'm just...
Because New York is an empirical concept, encompasses the lines drawn by the federal and state government.
But it's not what's necessarily implied by people's conversation.
The microorganisms that make up New York have decided for themselves that New York is not a singular concept. It's something that applies separately to downstate as opposed to upstate or western or any of these.
So when all the small constituent elements of the being, see, we're being consistent with this whole metaphor, are clashing, are asserting, no, go this way, no, go that way, no, go the other way, then the integrity of the organism begins to diminish into if not paralysis, then a inconsistency.
Right. And I mean, that coming back to the original metaphor, autophagy is a process that is in the news right now, because talking about intermittent fasting or timed feeding, where like, okay, well, if you can starve yourself some, it tells your body that something bad is going on. It clears out your dead or useless cells and you become healthier because of it. But there's multiple kinds of that, where it's also something that happens if you're extremely sick or if you in old age, that sort of thing. And the processes are different and it can have very different outcomes. So yeah, sometimes the strife or the arguments, the confusion and whatnot can lead to a healthier, more vibrant and vital being. And sometimes it can lead to, death, something very bad.
See, John Locke, we'll go back to John Locke. So I was just thinking, I'm looking over your shoulder, and of course, this is a podcast, we don't see it. There's on the curtain, I'm thinking of that circle, but if you look at the shape, is that really a circle? It's
probably an oval.
It's an oval. Yeah. But if I said the circle, you'd know what I was talking about, because in contrast to what?
There's no other shapes that are close to that.
Right, so it's in a window pane. So it's in a rectangular spot. Okay, so intuitive knowledge takes two ideas and finds agreement or disagreement between them to establish the knowledge of either. John Locke says, okay. Then we have demonstrative knowledge, deducing the truth from a sequence of intuitions. Now we're doing Pythagorean theorem. Now we're doing math. Okay. And then we have sensitive knowledge. This knowledge acquired through the senses. This is the least certain. As we just said, my senses are telling me circle. Oh, nope, I'm sitting here thinking sphere, but it's not really a sphere because it doesn't have depth to it. So, but it is an oval.
Right. And as you start to, as science is advanced and you understand brain concepts and things, you begin to understand why that works. All of your sensory information is shunted through your amygdala, and your amygdala can actually send signals back to your body before any other processing or computing happens in your brain. And that's where reactions come from. So if you see something flying at you out of the corner of your eye, your amygdala might say, oh my gosh, that's a rock. You need to duck. You need to cover your head or whatnot. When in reality, it was your friend throwing a marshmallow at you or something, When the proper response would have been to turn your head and catch it in your mouth, instead you're ducking and covering your head. So if you look at it from a purely philosophical standpoint, that reaction doesn't make sense. You received sensory information that a marshmallow was flying at your head and you duck it and covered. Well, it doesn't make sense. But when you apply the brain knowledge, okay, well, actually we know that there's a mechanism to protect you that sends you information back down saying that this is a worst case scenario, even though we don't have all the information. We didn't allow all of the computing to happen. And that makes you realize that these guys that were thinking about it hundreds of years ago already knew that without knowing the specifics. All right, sensory knowledge is not going to be certain. We already.
In fact, we may even Alvin Plantinga, again in the 20th century, was toying with the idea that we may have evolved necessary false beliefs for our survival. Well, it just occurred to me in hearing you talk about that. Okay, so it was a marshmallow, not a stone, but you survived.
Right.
And so what? You didn't eat the marshmallow. At least you didn't get hit by a stone, or misperceptions, which I think fall in this category. So I know that I've told my students a number of times in the past, when I drive from Warsaw to Batavia over a road called East Hill, when it's snowing, over and over again, toward the top of, outside of a small town named Wyoming, there is a configuration of mailboxes and a phone pole, which, because of their angles, are suggestive of somebody about to walk across the road. And I slow down every time I see that, because I think it's like the joke that just keeps happening. Fool me once, fool me twice, fool me again. Well, okay, so I slow down and I don't hit somebody, and there's nobody to hit because it's an illusion, an optical illusion, but my senses, which are inaccurate, are still warning me that there's a pattern that could be a problem. So the pattern knowledge. So that's one level. The other level of evolving perhaps false beliefs is so that we just simply survive and reproduce. People would argue, okay, we invented all of the clusters of viewpoints on romance and everything just so we'd say, okay, let's reproduce. We evolved these entire structures which enable us to manage to live with each other.
Right. And yet, if you look at human reproduction versus animal reproduction, you'll notice vastly different patterns, like you said, with the romantic sort of implications and stuff. But all of those things have to do with most likely population control. It wouldn't make sense to reproduce as animals do, because you might very quickly end up with too many offspring that you can't take care of. And then that's not beneficial to the increase of the species. Or you might end up in situations where now you have a mother by herself trying to take care of a certain number of children, and a father that is, nowhere to be seen. And none of those things are beneficial. And so some of these other things are brought about in order to reinforce patterns of behavior that are beneficial to the progress of the species.
Social evolutionists, Richard Dawkins, and many, many others would take Plantinga's work also and say, look, this is why we still have religion. Now, this is, again, I always have to say this when we're talking, because I'm not slamming those of religious faith. I truly am not. But if you understand the idea that if we think we know enough things that perhaps Nietzsche said God is dead. He wasn't saying God is literally dead. He's just saying the concept is no longer necessary. All right, well, that's the idea. But if it stays, if despite all the potential difficulties that are associated with religion and all the wonderful things, but if the difficulties outweigh the wonderful things and it stays, that means it has some kind of evolutionary use. And maybe the clusters of beliefs systems help people get through the day, help people have a better experience of life, and therefore life is richer, and therefore, we want life to continue. So, but that's a different kind of knowledge.
And I'm gonna try to segue into our next place here. I don't know how successful I'll be, but so the next part of it is discrepancies, and we're going to talk about the blind men and the elephant parable, and I think that does apply to the things we've been talking about. We talked about New York. It has these boundaries that are empirically say it's New York. The same way, we look at an elephant and the whole thing is talking about an elephant. We wouldn't look at a tusk and say it's an elephant, but we look at the whole thing and say that's an elephant. Well, the blind man parable says, well, if you have three blind men and one of them is holding the tail and one of them's holding a trunk and one of them's holding a tusk, and you ask them to describe the animal that they're touching, they're all going to say extremely different things. The same way a New Yorker from Wyoming County is going to say New York is a different thing from a New Yorker in the Bronx. The same way somebody who is a pastor is going to say God or the purpose of religion is different from somebody who is a social evolutionist. The same way somebody who is newly in love is going to say romance or reproduction is different from somebody who has been married 60 years or has never been married. All of these people are experiencing a concept, one concept, in very different ways and are going to describe it very differently. So discrepancies in knowledge, that's kind of what we were talking about already. Is there anything more to add philosophically about that concept? Having a core concept, something that is empirically defined, and then having people who are only privy to a certain experience or certain knowledge about that concept and how they integrate that into knowledge.
Yes, I think there is. Two things. Well, so there's an ism, reliabilism, which says that in order to better achieve is the right word, but to arrive at knowledge, you need to consider the processes that have led you to that. And so if you consider what has led to that so-called knowledge, cause and effect, whatever it is, what's the process that has led you to this intuition or this observation, and why did you build from that observation to the next thing? A careful analysis like that can make you perhaps more accurate.
And so the human instinct is to consider your own experiences more heavily than others, which makes sense because if we look at it philosophically, I can't even prove that you're an actual person. All I can prove is that I'm a person. So as a result, I'm going to take my knowledge, and let's say I've had bad luck with relationships. And I can say, oh, well, love doesn't actually exist or romance doesn't actually exist. And this is something that I dealt with when I started getting married. I got married pretty young. And a lot of people told me, oh, you don't want to do that. Oh, it's terrible. You're going to have such a terrible time. And it freaked me out a little bit because even though I had good experiences myself, now you're looking at and you're amalgamating and integrating opinions and knowledge from others into the overall concept of what love is. So, as a child or as your first experience in love, you might have a certain viewpoint, but then as you go through different relationships or as people give you their input, now you're building the concept from parts borrowed from other people. And the overall view of that concept is going to determine, I think, your attitudes towards it and how you interact with it and a lot of different things.
It will. And that's why the reliabilism is important, because there's nothing like birth and marriage to elicit a cascade of not necessarily unwanted, but more TMI kinds of stories. Okay, so somebody tells you, well, the marriage sucks, or somebody tells you that, oh, marriage is the most wonderful thing, or somebody tells you, oh, you're going to have trouble, as you said. Well, okay. If you're exercising a bit of reliabilism, you say, well, what do I know about the person who's telling me this? What process has she or he been through that would lead them to that particular thing? But sometimes we don't do that. We say, oh my God, it's going to be terrible. Oh my gosh, it's going to be wonderful. Why? Because they told me so.
Right. So if you see somebody, well, this guy's a self-centered jerk, and I've dealt with my whole life. He doesn't think about anybody but himself, and he has no filter when he talks about all this stuff. Well, it's probably not all that surprising if he tells you that love doesn't exist or that all women are terrible or something like this. Whereas if you run across somebody who's extremely empathetic and personable and stuff, if they were to tell you the exact same thing, you might give it more weight. Whereas if you've met 10 of these empathetic people and they all say that love is a good thing, then you might begin to add that to your concept of what love is. It's
reinforcing things. So this is the process. So Richard Rorty, one of my favorite contemporary philosophers, he says that truth is an ongoing conversation. That there's no, I remember older people in my life saying, well, the fact of the matter is, and he says, no, there's no fact of the matter. That there's no outside human generated knowledge conventions. And so in other words, knowledge is not this neutral mirror reflecting something that's independent of us. That doesn't, for him, for a number of contemporary philosophers, nope. Knowledge is arrived at by the people that we talk to, what we hear, what we take in, what we observe, but understanding that even what we observe, how you observe, we were talking before the podcast, I was going to San Francisco and 14 microclimates or something like that. All right. Now, somebody told you there were 14 microclimates based on their own experiences of having lived there. You're saying, nah.
Right. Even though this guy, he's a tour guide, this is what he does day in and day out. He drives through all of these things. He's lived there for who knows how long. I'm still doubting his expertise because I've never experienced anything like that before.
Precisely. And he also might be being a showman because he's trying to keep your attention.
Yeah,
and so right. So, but then you experience them and you say, oh my gosh, well, maybe you didn't count 14, but maybe you experience a number of shifts. So you say, okay, so whatever the number, there are some interesting things going on here. All right. So Rorty says that there's no independent fact that just hangs out there and we're a neutral mirror reflecting it. That the very fact of our interaction with it, with whatever it is we're interacting with, means that we begin to see the things that for whatever stack of reasons we privilege, we want to believe, or we notice more. And so because we notice it more, that must be the most important element. Back to the elephant. If I'm feeling an elephant, even if I'm one blind man and running my hand over the elephant, I might find the tusk to be the most interesting part. And so when I describe it, I might describe this mass, but it's a mass with a pointy front, which is a mighty point. And therefore, so the elephant in its entirety is not being described. The sensitive information coming from our senses is being privileged.
Yeah, okay. And I think this is a good segue into applications of knowledge. So human traits, we've talked a little bit about how we apply knowledge, but let's talk about how do intelligence and wisdom and language direct that process. And we've gotten into it a little bit, but so what separates knowledge from intelligence or knowledge from wisdom? And how does language sort of mediate or help us conceptualize that whole process?
By the very fact that we define things as two different things, language is just fascinating and wonderful and beyond our ken sometimes. So the very fact that we say there's knowledge and then there's wisdom suggests that they're two different entities. Now we're back to the intuitive defining against something else.
But are we saying that just because somebody thousands of years ago came up with a different thing because they decided it's a different thing? Let's us decide for ourselves.
Right. So what would you say wisdom is?
This is the way I would sort of define it for myself off the cuff. I would say wisdom is the application of knowledge, and intelligence is your ability to accrue knowledge. So you have one at the front end that's bringing things in, a collection of this item, and then how you use that item. So it's almost like a building process. You take a piece of wood, you carve it into something, and then you use that carving to accomplish a task. That's sort of the intelligence, knowledge, wisdom sort of.
We're done. You said that so well. There's no, but you have just encapsulated the modern contemporary, one of the stronger views. That's what differentiates. One's a capacity, one's which can be developed. One is observational. One is synthesis, putting it together, deciding what is the most important element of all those things that have been gathered and processed.
So are there other views of it, or is that pretty well the accepted paradigm
of wisdom versus knowledge? Well, yeah, there's the experiential. I think you mentioned that before. There's I think it's not entirely false notion, but certainly not entirely true that accrued experience can lead to wisdom if all of the experience accrued is continuing to be reflectivity. Some philosophers, people, ordinary people would say, you don't have wisdom unless you reflect. Well, wisdom is a reflect. Wisdom emerges from looking back at all this stuff. Mm. So we have these, as my father often for it, he calls cell phones your brain. He says, okay, guys, pull out your brain and let's look at so we can look at our brain or we can look at our note cards, remind us of things. But if we don't have anything but our note cards or our cell phone, our brain, so to speak, it's just a bunch of statements, a bunch of propositions. And that's totally granular and Lego-like and disconnected. So knowledge involves perhaps beginning to connect, and wisdom says, here's the bigger picture.
So can somebody have some of these things, or to what extent can somebody have one of these concepts without having the others? Can somebody be intelligent but not knowledgeable or wise? Can they be knowledgeable without being intelligent or wise? Can they be wise without being intelligent or knowledgeable? Can you separate out these things? What extent can you do that to?
Well, let's put it to the test. Let's see if we can think of a situation where someone might be intelligent without being knowledgeable.
Okay.
Let's add a little mix into it. Somebody who doesn't have formal education.
Okay. So to me, my creative side is imagining like Leonardo DiCaprio from Titanic. Like here you got this guy and like at every turn he's doing something smart, something slick. He's always getting somewhere. But at the same time, he obviously doesn't have a collection of information that he can draw off of to make wise decisions that have built up a lifestyle.
He's intuitively intelligent, or he might be observationally.
Or maybe a better natural example would be a shark. If you look at a shark has a very small brain, but an enormous CNS, central nervous system. So as a result, sharks are very intuitive, and as a result, they're very nimble, very agile, and they're able to accomplish something very quickly. But there's no collection of knowledge or reflection on what's happening. It's more, they know if something does this, they're going to do this to react very quickly and accomplish a task. That would probably be considered a form of intelligence,
but not a form of wisdom,
knowledge or wisdom.
Yeah. Exactly. And so this is what takes us into that muddy pit behind the barn of where people like to privilege things because they don't necessarily have the other thing, rather than looking at the integration. So that people will denigrate book learning. My family, my person, I didn't go to school and I'm very smart. Or I've had students who will often say, I've got a grandfather who's just the most intelligent person and he never cracked open a book. And he says that you don't need to go to school because you can be smart without it. Okay. What they're not thinking about is, of course, the grandfather has an intelligence, and he probably has an accrued experiential intelligence that guides him wonderfully in whatever work and so on he's done. And he probably has developed an experiential wisdom from that body of knowledge for where he lives and what he does. But that doesn't mean that learning from books is bad, and that doesn't mean that somehow you're elitist if you learn from books. What one would hope is obvious that you would put the two things together and then become even more intelligent and more complete in your gatherings, right. So that it might lead you to some wisdom that otherwise wouldn't occur because you didn't have, as you said, the set of things to draw from.
Yeah, and I think that there's sort of archetypes that you can build out of academics and blue collar people, but that doesn't mean it's a hard and fast rule. The guy who invented the periodic table was so slow that when he went to movies, he had to bring somebody along to explain to him the plot of the movie because he he couldn't follow quick enough to know what was going on. But given a couple decades, this guy could construct this thing. And I identify more with that. There's a lot of people who are more, I may have a higher knowledge base or more wisdom, but that fast thinking, sort of that intelligence, I don't really have it. So like that in the moment arguing, there's sometimes where I can get backed into a corner and be like, and then 5 or 10 minutes later, I'll have a perfectly constructed argument that's bulletproof, but the moment's passed, they're gone. Right. So I think, so that's a little bit of the intelligence.
That's why we need the variety.
Right. And so that heads into the knowledge base. Can you have knowledge without the other two? And I think that one might be a little bit simpler to construct because we just talked about it a little bit.
Yeah. You can have knowledge.
Yeah.
It's right there. Stack of note cards. Alexa.
Right.
Will leads you right to it.
Right. There you go. You don't need intelligence because you're not using a bunch of inductive or deductive reasoning to get there. You might just be presented with information and you might be able to accept that as knowledge through the empirical things around that imply it has a truth to it.
And if you don't have, we're not talking all or nothing. So if I say you don't have the intelligence thing, you don't have intelligence at all. That's silly. No. But so you have let's say you have your cell phone, you have Google, or not an endorsement of a product, by the way. So if you don't know or haven't learned or how to do a guided search, and you're just depending upon some Alexa or whatever it is, or you just, you do a search and the first 5 things that show up, you say, well, there's the answer, and you go to it. And you go to that answer and you like it, and you don't look at the authority of what the source of information is. You like it, and therefore it must be so, even if it's from a wildly inaccurate and unauthoritative place. Well, you can gain knowledge, but that knowledge may not be accurate.
Right. And I think the last one is the one that you'd sort of balk at a little bit. Can you have wisdom without knowledge or intelligence? And I think the initial assumption is probably not, because wisdom is taking knowledge and making something out of it. But to me, it's sort of an example I would think of is if you had somebody who, let's say you find somebody from a third world country and they have never had any kind of formal education, and maybe they have a malnutrition or a life situation that has caused them to have a lack of intelligence. They might still make good decisions based off the little knowledge or intelligence they have. They might still be empathetic people. They might still be, they might be able to make good decisions based off of the amount that they have. So I think that basically what this whole thing is kind of established is that there are 3 different concepts for a reason. And even though they do interrelate, you can't have one without the other. There's enough of a difference that warrants different concepts. So let's look at the flip side of it a little bit, which is, ethics of knowledge and what are the implications of naivety or ignorance or lying? What has philosophy said about some of those negative aspects of knowledge?
Yeah. Utilitarian knowledge or utilitarianism, consequentialism is part of that. And we've talked about that before. Would the needs of many outweigh the needs of the few, or the greatest good, whatever we're defining as good, or the greatest pleasure, however we're defining as pleasure, probably not the lowest end of the Maslow chart. If you make a decision based on those parameters, you're making a decision that's probably a good one, and therefore you're working on the knowledge that you have to affect that decision. But if you purposely make a decision that is going to lead to harm, if you purposely want to harm a group of people, and so you can write them off as, well, they're going to be hurt, but the greater number of people aren't, then utilitarians would say, no, you're not being ethical in the least, because you've consciously contemplated a harm to someone and wish it.
Right. So that brings, lying is the big one, because that brings up a huge issue, whether you're looking at it through a religious lens or a societal lens, regardless of a philosophical lens. And some people will say, okay, well, if one person's going to get hurt, but many are going to get benefited, then it's good. Whereas other people are going to say, no, lying is always bad. Or if you do it intentionally, it's always bad.
Think presidential fact checking. Now, it's done all the time. It's not just with the current president, but newspapers will do this. Well, fact checking is interesting because it means going back, looking at a statement a president has made, and then making a determination of some kind, whether it was an out and out lie, it was something that's been misunderstood and misrepresented to a small or a large degree, or that it was accurate. Well, most journalists work really hard not to use the word lie in fact checking. They will say this was far from the knowledge that we have. Here's the empirically measurable fact. So if somebody says 2,000 people are doing something, and there were 80, then there's a disconnect between those two kinds of things.
Right. And that's important because that brings in those other concepts. Now we're moving from lying to ignorance and naivety. And I think that in everyday life, like you're saying, people wouldn't draw that precise of a distinction. People would just say, oh, he's lying or whatever. But I think that the reason they distinguish on a presidential level is because a president's actual beliefs influence world policy. So if he's lying about something versus being ignorant about something or being naive about something, all three of those things have different possible outcomes for how he influences policy. If he's flat out lying about something, he might influence a policy about what he actually believes. If he's ignorant about something, he
still might influence the policy, but why he's influencing the policy that way might not be.
Has different motivations.
And this is true. This is why I think we need to bring it down to our regular relationships. When people leap to, let's think of someone that you work with, or the cluster of people you interact with frequently. And we all have characters in our lives, and sometimes we make some of them villains, and sometimes we make some of them allies, and all of that kind of stuff in the narratives that we weave. But if, and I say this as a very flawed person, we all don't always do this, and we don't do it nearly as much as we should. If we looked at the statements that are made and didn't just leap, you're lying. Well, how would it be different in the relationship if you say you're inaccurate? People don't like to be inaccurate, but it still sounds better than lying. Or there's some stuff you don't know that really might cause you to think differently.
Right. And the biggest one that I think of right off the bat, because I've struggled with it for a while, is road rage. Not rage. I don't road rage, but like attitudes. And so this is probably a good example for it. Let's say I'm driving on the road on the highway and there's a big lifted truck, right? Yeah. So if he drives past me fast and cuts me off, I might get extremely angry because I've woven this narrative. The people that drive this truck and people that drive this way and do this thing are villains. And that's going to be my knowledge of it. Now, if we transport ourselves to the guy inside the truck, maybe he really is a malicious character. He sees me driving in my car and thinks, oh, this guy's a loser, cuts me off. That's one possible scenario. Maybe the guy's wife is in this seat having a baby and he's rushing to get to the hospital. And that would be a different thing. Or maybe the guy has a problem with spatial relationships and thinks that he's given me enough space and pulls in and cut me off completely on accident. All three of those are different scenarios. All three of them rely on different kinds of knowledge. And really, it brings up that sort of separation between, ignorance in making a decision, or being naive about how a process works, or intentional malicious behavior. But regardless, it's not really my job as the person driving the other car to make that decision. But what I decide to believe about it can influence my attitudes. In one of those situations, I'm probably going to be screaming inside my car with my raised blood pressure. Or in another one, I might be thinking, I hope he gets wherever he's going safe. Or in the other one, I might be thinking, man, this guy kind of needs to learn how to drive. It only affects me, my attitudes, my thought about how I construct knowledge about how this other driver is behaving.
And this is what Buddhism, as one example of many things, this is what yoga practice is about, is you just hit it. Whatever that interaction was with you and yourself in that car thinking about this, it affected your physicality, it affected your presence of mind, it affected your blood pressure, it affects the way another moment in the day has gone. It might cause you to think of yourself as, well, I'm a better driver than, all these kind of things, rather than just saying, okay, I've adjusted for the conditions and now we go on.
Yeah. And all of this reflects back on the entire conversation we've had from the beginning. That's non-foundational knowledge. I'm stringing together a number of arguments to try to come to a conclusion. Oh, does this guy drive a lifted truck? Oh, is he driving a certain speed? Is he doing a certain thing? Does he have certain bumper stickers? Can I see in there? Is he wearing a hat? All these things. And then you're really constructing beliefs, not knowledge. But those beliefs added to previous experiences are constructing the knowledge base that you're drawing off of to make decisions.
That's what Plato said in one of his dialogues, the Theaetetus. He said that talks about justified true belief, which means that we look back again at the experiences that we have. We think logically or reasonably through what we construct with those experiences. Why have we arrived at the opinion we've arrived at? See, we're still talking about that in the 21st century, using different names for it, but it came back from as far back as Plato. Do we need to do those things? Why? So then the ontological question, the being part is, why do we need to assert that we are better drivers? Or why do we need to weave this narrative out of what are we drawing it? We can see an 18-wheeler truck. We don't even necessarily see the driver's face. What difference would it make if we saw their face at a distance? We wouldn't know anything. If we were sitting with them in a restaurant, we might see whether they're tired, whether they've taken too many, maybe we can take a guess they've taken too many uppers because they're trying to drive too far. But then we know the companies are trying to push drivers to go further beyond it than they should. But we're going to blame the driver because it's just, he's a jerk. And I want to say he's a jerk because it just felt better. My blood pressure has gone down after I've said it, right? Yeah. The justification of a belief doesn't mean we still arrived at knowledge. It means we've arrived at a better understanding of what we think is knowledge.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good place to wrap that up. I think we really covered that whole thing. So the question I was going to ask was, can knowledge save the human species? And I think that's something that a lot of people think about sort of regardless of, your situation, whether you're looking at it from a climate change point of view or a political point of view, and those things will influence. You might think that building a wall on the southern border is the way to protect our tribe, our nation. You might think that, ridding CO2 emissions is a way to save it. Whatever the case may be, do you think that knowing more can save the species as a whole? And so the first sort of thing that I came up with was the exponential curve of knowledge acquisition makes it likely we'll find answers to problems facing us. So if you're looking at whether, climate change issues, we're coming up with new technologies all the time. Or you look at political issues, sometimes it takes an extremely long period of time. But if you have a policy implemented, you're going to see the fruits of it. And, I think a shutdown is kind of a good case. So you have these two, when the government shutdown starts, you have two sides that are completely opposed to one another. There's no middle ground. And you think, well, this is never going to end then. But as time goes on, one or both sides are going to accrue knowledge about the situation as it's unfolding and and eventually one or both of them are going to come to a conclusion about the inability of this to continue, and a decision will be made about how it's going to end, whether it's a compromise or a complete
a temporary or permanent.
Essentially, knowledge, even if it looks like both positions are in one place that's not going to move, it's not going to be the case forever. There's going to be knowledge happening. There's going to be things happening. So the acquisition of knowledge is likely to answer problems that we face. Humans are very good at problem solving.
We are. But there is that factor of time in the space-time continuum. Mm-hmm. So if knowledge is disseminated, if knowledge is embraced, if empirical facts are cross-reference checked and over again prove to be so, and you still decide not to act on those things, then you might not save the species, or you might not save as many of the species as you could, because there is a diminishing window, whether you're talking about climate change or economics. I mean, ultimately you talk about the shutdown, and what seems to be the case is that a whole lot of people realized that they didn't want planes falling out of the sky because traffic controllers were not going to be there, and radar is not being tended to, and technology is already beginning to fall apart after a month. You see, the sheer fragility of our technologies becomes readily apparent when you shut down just a little bit of this thing you've created, and you can pretend that it doesn't matter a bit, but hard knowledge actually intrudes. And so then but that was a time thing in the case of the shutdown.
Yeah, and that goes into the next point, which is resource scarcity will make survival difficult. And again, you can apply this to climate change or political situations. Yeah, it doesn't matter what the situation is. Resources are scarce. And so as a result, as you acquire knowledge, you might find more efficient ways to use resources, or you might realize that resources that you were using previously and are now unavailable need to be found. But scarcity is a driving factor in survival. It is what it boils down to. If you're looking to survive, you need to be able to utilize resources that are important for that survival. And, air traffic controllers are a resource.
They are a resource. And if we're going to continue to grow, if we're going to continue to expand, then we need to get off the planet. Stephen Hawking was talking about that. Not all of us. We don't leave the building behind, but there comes a point where the lobsters need to crawl out of the pot before they die.
Oh, yeah.
And
that's my last point, which is even as a spacefaring species, our time would eventually run out. Because of dark energy kind of spreading everything around and, things getting farther away, and the loosening grip of gravity to draw things together and have these covalent bonds, everything's going to cool down and become a black hole or a white dwarf, and is going to become a place inhospitable to light.
We are finite.
Right. So we can jump from planet to planet. Well, we don't know if we can. It's really the clock between resource scarcity and acquisition of knowledge. Can we acquire knowledge fast enough to make a jump before resources run out?
Assuming a will to do so as well. Right. Because you can gather all the facts that you want. But yeah, if we stayed on the planet, it's what you just said. We know this about stellar evolution, about the lifetime of a star. We've observed enough of them. If we stay on this planet, in 4 billion years, more or less, the planet won't exist. It will be a cinder, because by then the star will have expanded as it changes, as it diminishes. which is interesting. Expansion and diminishment.
Yeah, you expand into a red dwarf, but really the star is diminishing.
So the Earth becomes a piece of charcoal or a marshmallow flying at your head. So there's an end point, but as usual, lots of people don't want to consider the end point. It's not fun, but
yeah, and it doesn't matter if it's on an individual term or on a species term. We know it. Like we know that we'll die as individuals, and we also know that we're going to die as a species. So how does that knowledge affect how we live as people, but also how does that knowledge affect how we decide to move forward and contribute to society?
Man, that sounds like another podcast.
I think it is. So, but I think that we touched on a lot of important stuff about knowledge. I think it's something that's going to pop up a lot in future podcasts as well. It's always going to be something that we come back to. So thank you for listening to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. The recording and production are provided by me, Joel Bouchard, and the song featured in the show is Questions off of my album Jaguars, which you can find on Spotify or anywhere MP3s are sold. Until next time, keep pondering.